Good morning. The past weeks have been stunning. Now, I was not stunned by the existence of police violence. I've long known that black people are often stopped, beaten, and killed more often than white people. And I've had to have the conversation with my African American son about being polite and doing whatever he can to not be killed by a white police officer. And I've heard his frustration when he says sitting still doesn't work, sleeping doesn't work, telling the police that you have a gun permit and you have a license to carry doesn't work. Running away doesn't work. And he's frustrated that nothing will work if somebody wants to kill you. But what I'm stunned at, that somehow this time, white folks across the country are starting to get it. A little town near me that has about 10,000 people, where I grew up, they've had 2 protests, 2 marches. And this town is 98% white. Something's happening in America. The killing of George Floyd appears to be a tipping point. 8 years ago, when the Black Lives Matter movement started, after George Zimmerman, a vigilante, was not convicted for hunting and killing a teenager named Trayvon Martin, this movement was seen as a radical anti-police, anti-American movement. And I had to do a lot of sermons explaining to even liberal white folks that this is not the case. But people's understanding of this grew as more and more murders were seen. Rapper and comedian Will Smith said that it's not necessarily getting worse, it's just getting filmed. And what we have seen over this past year is what African Americans have felt for decades. Unitarian Universalism has long been a leader in abolition and civil rights. Yet we have often sat in the place of white privilege, focusing on academic achievement and being articulate. We've had difficulty attracting and welcoming African Americans and other minorities, and even people who are middle class, lower middle class, working class people. In response, Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism was formed, and I believe it's time, way past time, for white Unitarian Universalists to listen to these voices in our midst. They share our tradition and call us to live up to our highest ideals. At George Floyd's funeral this weekend and at the peaceful, prayerful protest I attended on Saturday, I have heard language that says racism is sin and it comes from the devil, and we must pray to God to heal us from our sinfulness and unite under the rule of King Jesus. This language is mysterious to me. I hope that it helps the faithful to hear a language in their tradition that will make them more open to racial justice. But for me, I need to stop blaming the devil, and we need to stop waiting for God to fix it. I want to confront how I am culpable for the current situation, and I want to work responsibly to change myself and the community. I begin and I hope you will join me in listening to the voices of Black Lives, the Unitarian Universalists. I read from their website. Formed in the wake of several conversations among Black UUs at July 2015 Movement for Black Lives convening in Cleveland, Ohio, the Blue Organizing Collective is committed to expanding the power and capacity of Black UUs within our faith, providing support, information, and resources for Black Unitarian Universalists, justice-making, and liberation through our faith. The purpose of this organization is a religious community for Black Unitarian Universalists who are committed to living out our principles through culturally relevant and affirming expressions of our diverse experience and diasporic African descendants and Black people. We see a direct link between the 7 principles and the movement for Black Lives. Those of us at the Moment for Black Lives Convention, along with other Black UUs, created this document to present to our faith the 7 principles of Black lives. Our hope that the direct connection between our faith and the fight for Black liberation will make clear the urgent, written in all caps, the urgent need for all of those who call themselves Unitarian Universalists to declare, without caveat or clarification, that Black lives matter. I was pleased to see in this week's paper that our own Dave McCracken wrote the same thing in his letter to the editor. They released the 7 principles of Black Lives Matter and talk about how they connect with our overall 7 principles. Principle 1, all Black lives matter. Queer Black lives, trans Black lives, formerly incarcerated Black lives, differently abled Black lives, Black women's lives, immigrant Black lives, Black elderly and children's lives, all Black lives matter. And they're the creators of this space. They throw no one under the bus. They rise together. The movement for Black lives calls on the Unitarian Universalist faith, a faith willing to make bold proclamations that each person inherently matters, to live up to that claim by working towards a future in which Black lives are truly valued by our society. We call on UUs to actively resist notions that Black lives only matter if conform to white middle-class norms, and to challenge the assumptions of worth centered around clothing, diction, education, and other status. Our value is not conditional. When I hear this, I think of intersectionality. We have to be open to all people across gender definitions and social standings. And when we see a Black person, we must see them as a whole person. In 25 years of ministry, I have witnessed 2 mistakes that are common among UUs. 1, we see only blackness. White UUs, we see only blackness. And we ask Black people in our midst to speak for all Black people. We seldom, if ever, ask a white person to explain all white people. And let me tell you, these days, white people are particularly confusing to me. A second mistake is that we ignore their blackness as white Unitarian Universalists. We recognize a person's education, their place in the arts, their friendliness. We make all sorts of connections, and we sometimes say we like them in spite of their blackness. And that's what they mean in their principle when they say black lives seem to only matter if conform to white middle-class norms and centered around clothing, diction, education, and other status. We have to be careful to not see only their blackness or pretend that it isn't there. We say it does not matter they are black, but it matters to them, and it should matter to us. Part of white privilege is the ability to forget about race. Whiteness is just a blank page on which we write our individual lives. We ignore, as white people, whiteness, and it becomes invisible to us. But we must learn to see our whiteness and remember that many are not given a white page to write on. They must carve their stories in the buildings and the streets, spray paint on the walls, tell their story orally, and hope someone will listen, sometimes having to shout to overcome the deafness. Returning to bluu.org, principle number 2. Self-love is practiced in every element we do. Love and self-love must be drivers of all our work and indicators of our success. Without this principle and without healing, we will harm each other and undermine our movement. The movement for Black lives seeks to build a society where Black people thrive instead of survive. We seek justice for those who have lost to police violence. We seek equity in housing, education, health care. We seek compassion from our fellow UUs for the struggle we are called to be a part of. The second principle of Unitarian Universalists is justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. And they talk about it as love and self-love. I hear this as a call to put our money where our mouth is, to practice what we preach. The murder of George Floyd occurred during a pandemic, which has laid bare all the inequities in healthcare, living conditions, and workplace conditions. And the word inequity is interesting to me because this is where I can connect with the fundamentalist Christians who are working on race relations. Because inequity has the same root as the King James word for sin, iniquity. And in that sense, this is a sin that we must overcome. The iniquity, the inequity. Minorities are getting higher COVID-19 rates. They've been forced to work in high-risk jobs in nursing homes, meat-packing plants. Housing tends to be overpriced and crowded, making it harder to social distance. Health insurance in this country is mostly tied to jobs that were lost in the pandemic, and access to health care has been less than for white folks. What are we doing as Unitarian and Universalists to bring justice, equity, and compassion? Principle 3. Spiritual growth is directly tied to our ability to embrace our whole selves. A principled struggle must exist in a positive environment. We must be honest with one another by embracing direct, loving communication and acknowledgement of all that we are and hope to be. The spiritual growth of UUs of color is directly tied to our ability to stand in the truth that Black lives matter, that our lives matter, both in the wider world and just as importantly in our UU congregations. We call on our congregations and to the UUA to support our work and work towards wholeness as Black people. We must be honest with one another by embracing direct, loving communication. To me, this principle echoes our third principle, and it calls for radical acceptance of people. Whites must accept people who are trying to build a way out of no way. We must recognize how many rivers they have crossed to find our congregations. Direct, loving communication is not always easy. We need to forget our comfort zone, because our comfort zone is inherently a place of segregation and domination. We must do the work of building new community. We must encourage, give courage to one another when things get difficult. And things do get difficult. Then, and only then, can we hope for spiritual growth. BLUU principle number 4. Experimentation and innovation must be built into our work. Embrace the best tools, practices, and tactics. Leave behind those that no longer serve us. Evaluation and assessment must be built into our work. Critical reflection must be part of all of our work. We learn from our mistakes and our victories. In this, I hear the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. We must try new things because the old ways are forever broken and we can't return to them. And sometimes the old way never worked for a large segment of our population. Recently, this congregation had a building project. We tore down some old walls and we added some new ones. We did this to increase the capacity of the building. This relatively easy task was fraught with conflict because everyone cared so deeply about this congregation. It will be more difficult to tear down walls that we do not see. It will be more difficult to build new social structures. There will be debates about whether certain walls exist, and there will be debates about how much we should change to include people different than those who have already gathered at the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of New Bern. Some things will work, and some things will fail spectacularly. But we must be brave in our experimentation, fearless in our self-evaluation, responsible to make the changes necessary so everybody's search for meaning can be free of hate and prejudice. Principle number 5. The most directly affected people are experts on their own life. Those most directly affected by racial injustice and oppression should be in leadership at the center of our movement and telling their stories directly. This is the people of Black Lives, UU speaking. We stand in the movement for Black lives at a time in which voting rights are being threatened at every turn. Black people are being denied the most basic of rights, the right to vote, and have adequate representation in our country. We work towards a society in which black life is valued, in which black life is not discarded, in which black lives matter, and in which the work of black people is seen as equal to their white counterparts. Black voices in our congregations, in our faith, and in the world must be valued. In democracy, there is the principle of one person, one vote. This is because each person should be respected. In George Orwell's book, Animal Farm, at first all animals were equal. And then some animals decided that some animals were more equal than others. Excuses are made, and sometimes invented. North Carolina is a battleground for the right to vote. Gerrymandering, suppression, disenfranchise are tactics by those who want to continue and maintain white dominance. And the notion that corporations are people and money is speech, which cruelly is derived from the very amendments that gave African Americans rights after the Civil War. These ideas make the playing field unequal. We do not need reform. We need reconstruction within our denomination and within our nation. Black people are the experts on the black experience. They should be respected and believed. I could read books about Thelonious Monk and probably learn more about Thelonious Monk than Thelonious Monk knew himself. But it was his genius that created that tune that Judy played. There was something in him that is worth listening to. And no amount of analysis of the chords he was using can define what he did. We learn by listening and experiencing, not just by books. Principle 6. Thriving instead of surviving. Black Lives of Unitarian Universalist Right. Our vision is based on the world we want, not the world we currently in. We seek for transformation, not simply to react. We want our people to thrive, not just exist, and to think beyond the possible. Any work towards peace, liberty, and justice must address the social and racial injustice. Black UUs are calling our faith to join us as we work towards justice for all black people, and by extension, all people. The 6th UU principle calls for a world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. This has never existed in the history of the world. It's unlikely to happen in our lifetime. But we have courage to live in hope. I love the phrase, we seek to transform rather than react. Since 9/11/2001, I personally have felt like I have been reacting to one crisis after another: war, civil rights, marriage equality, and the environment. What if we were to transform rather than react? What if we created within UU communities the world we want? What if within our small efforts we created a virus for good that spread throughout the world and transformed it. Racial justice is tied to environmental justice, economic justice, political justice, and justice even in the justice system itself. We have to think of new ways to imagine a better world. By stretching towards the impossible, new possibilities will emerge. Black Lives of UU, principle number 7, 360-degree vision. We honor the past struggles and wisdom from our elders. The work we do today builds the foundations of movements tomorrow. We consider our mark on future generations. Acknowledging the way in which a supremacist society diminishes us all is a critical part of the work of the movement. When the most marginalized of our society is free, then all will truly be free. We call on our faith to affirm the truth that only when Black lives matter will all lives truly matter. As Dr. King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. The interdependent web means we have to realize all things are connected. Incarcerating Black people has cost white folks a lot of money that could be better spent elsewhere. Dumping environmental waste into poor neighborhood eventually poisons everyone's air and water. We must find ways to work together. We do not need everyone to be the same, but everyone must have the same chance to contribute and benefit. If we truly know we are part of an interdependent web, we realize that when we try to harm someone, it harms us. When we help one another, all are saved. May we bless and be blessed. Please join in singing Spirit of Life.